Well, talking of India, would you care to share with us some of your thoughts about India and your impressions and where we are and our role in the world?
Well, I have had, as I said, I've spent a lot of time thinking about India from my childhood. And by the way, as the perfect daughter, when I was a sophomore in high school, I wrote a paper on Mahatma Gandhi, so, But what happened, I think, as also a professor and an endless student, I've obviously studied India's role in the world, the non-aligned movement, the relationship that existed with the United States. I was very proud to work for President Clinton for any number of reasons. But one is that I think that he began the whole stage in our bilateral history of showing a renewed interest and a real dedication to improving the Indian-American relationship. And I came here with him in 1998-99 when he managed to charm 900 million Indians. And we spent a lot of time talking about what needed to be done to make sure that the relationship was one of interest, respect, partnership. I think it's not a secret that I disagreed with many things of the Bush administration, but I do think that what was interesting was to see a real building on that relationship. What I found interesting was during the Bush administration, I was doing some research on how the U.S.-Indian relationship had moved forward, and I saw that there was a man called Ashley Tellis who was on the National Security Council staff and was one of the instigators of the movement forward. And so I thought, well, who's Ashley Tellis with that waspy name? And it turns out that he came from Mumbai. So I'd used his example a lot about the influence of an individual on foreign policy, because I think he really was the spark, and then President Bush moved the whole process even further forward, and I think now there is a growing sense of partnership and relationship. Secretary Kerry is coming here later this week, and it is a sign of the importance of the relationship because he is new in his term early. Secretary Clinton was clearly very interested in India, and so it is a growing relationship. I think we have an awful lot of things that we do together, whether one talks about security issues. Some of the discussions that I've had in the last couple of days would indicate the importance of the relationship for the region. We can talk more about this in terms of as Afghanistan draws down our forces there, and just generally the strategic importance of India. Economically, we are quite linked and in some ways very interdependent, and I think that needs to be fostered further. And I think that for the last few years there have been issues about the growth of India, China, other countries, and there has been some kind of sadder press in terms of whether India's growth has been what it should have been in the last couple of years. And I think there's a sense that there is now a new momentum on growth, economic growth with India. So I see it as a relationship of partnership and respect and relationship for each other, which means, frankly, and you know this in your personal relationship, friends actually not only say nice things about each other, but also are pretty frank when there are problems. And so I think that frankness in the relationship is not a bad sign. I think it is one where we tell each other what our needs are, what the problems are, what the possibilities are for adjusting it. So I think it's a good relationship.
A natural progression of this discussion would be to a topic that's close to your heart, but it's also close to our minds here in India. We are constantly debating whether our democracy is good for us. Should we have a two-party system like in the US? Should we move to a presidential system? Should we not have had a more autocratic prime minister? We are always comparing ourselves to China from an economic growth standpoint. I know you feel passionately about democracy and you have some very compelling ideas. If you could share that with us today.
Given that I told you part of my life story, I came from a country, Czechoslovakia, which didn't exist until 1918, had been part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The country was started by people who felt very strongly that they could be a nation, and they wanted to be democratic. Interestingly enough, the first president of Czechoslovakia was a man called Thomas Garrigue Masaryk, who married an American woman, and her name was Charlotte Garrigue, and he took her maiden name as his middle name, which is quite forward-looking, given the fact that they were married in the last quarter of the 19th century. The Czechoslovak Constitution is mirrored on the American one, with a major exception. It had equal rights for women language in it in 1918. My parents, especially my father, was part of this generation of new people that were very patriotic Czechoslovaks and felt that this was something worth preserving. When the communists took over, my father came to the United States and taught at the University of Denver, and the thing that he taught about a lot was the fragility of democracy, how easily, in many ways, it could be subverted. And the example of what happened in Czechoslovakia in 1948 is part of that story. So I grew up with this sense of the importance of democracy and the fragility of democracy and the importance of having a citizenry that wants to preserve it. I happened, because life is weird, when I was in office, some of the issues that I had to deal with were specifically in terms of democracy spreading to a variety of different countries. And also in the 80s, I had some direct part in talking and doing a lot about democracy. And interestingly enough, I'm chairman of the board now of an organization called the National Democratic Institute, which was started by Ronald Reagan in the 1980s, because he said democracies were not good about defending themselves or explaining themselves vis-a-vis communism. And so I have thought a lot about the elements of democracy for a long time. And the question is, are you better off in a democracy? For me, the resounding answer is yes. Democracy is messy. Democracy is not an event, it is a process. And it is the way that it can use the best talents of its citizenry on behalf of each other. But it is a complicated process, and there is no one particular mode of democracy. You were saying presidential, parliamentary. The bottom line is that there are hybrid systems, and it has to suit the country in which it is. But it does require citizen action. But it is something also that is based on majority rule and minority rights. And there are many different groupings within India. And so as people look at it, I think people see it, at least from the outside, as a dynamic system. But it requires people to understand it and to respect each other. And then, what is interesting, people always say, well, so what are the elements that are necessary for democracy? Obviously, elections, necessary but not sufficient. You have to have a rule of law, an open media system, and, this is sometimes really hard to grasp, an opposition party. Because an opposition party is the only way that the voters have a choice and the people in power are accountable. The question is how many opposition parties. As you mentioned, the U.S. has a two-party system. We're a very different kind of party system because we have huge umbrella parties, and we have a right and left in them, and they don't often agree. And sometimes the center of both parties has more in common than the right and left of either party. And there are always issues sometimes about a third party, but 15 parties, a little tough.
I have a question for ma'am. Ma'am, in 1998, when India conducted the nuclear tests, there was a lot of strain on the relationship between India and US. In fact, there were sanctions imposed on our country. And there was a sense that we will face international isolation in the near future. And yet, President Clinton's visit in 2000 was said to be a game changer, where it set the precedent for other states and the next US administration to improve relationships with India. So could you just give us some sense of the thought process which went behind that visit by President Clinton, and what made the US change its stand towards India so drastically in such a short time?
First of all, let me say something about sanctions generally and what happens is our system of government, we have an executive and a legislative branch, and sometimes, let me actually back up on something else. The course I teach is, I say foreign policy is basically trying to have some country do what you want. That's what it's about. So what are the tools? And the course I teach is called the National Security Toolbox. And the truth is there's not a lot in a toolbox. Every country has the same tools, and they're not a lot. And so the tools are bilateral and multilateral diplomacy. Then there are the economic tools, which are like the carrots, or aid and trade, and then the sticks, which are sanctions and embargoes. Then there's the threat of the use of force, and law enforcement and intelligence. That's it. And so you are looking at a problem and trying to figure out what tool to use. The tools, and our Constitution is also set up so that it's sometimes called the invitation to struggle in terms of what are the powers of the executive branch and what are the powers of the legislative branch. And the legislative branch actually pays for the foreign policy, but also, in fact, deploys the economic tools as much as anything in terms of whether they pass trade agreements or, in fact, sometimes put sanctions on. And sometimes the sanctions are automatic, given what the law is. So if there is a nuclear use of peaceful nuclear or whatever, there is a set of sanctions that come in. And so, and some issues that then the executive branch has a hard time controlling it. So that's kind of the background of it. And I think that there really were issues to do with India's behavior, some also to do vis-a-vis Kashmir, and a variety of issues that then bring forth a set of not reprisals, but punishments, or whatever one would call it. I think President Clinton's thinking really was that he was very knowledgeable about what was going on in various parts of the world, and I think it was really a sense that it was important to have a relationship to get out of what had been seen in many ways a Cold War mode. President Clinton was not the first post-Cold War president. President Bush was. But a lot of what we were doing in the 90s was to get out of that and develop a whole set of new relationships. And so because during the Cold War it seemed that India was more with the Soviets or non-aligned, that it was important to bring India into kind of a relationship of partnership and friendship, which was the basis of it. And he had a personal interest in India, so that was the background. And it was really using tools then of personal diplomacy, then of trying to figure out what other economic relationships we could have. So that was kind of the background of it.
You were possibly part of the first and the pioneering effort to bring peace to the Middle East with respect to Yasser Arafat and Benjamin Netanyahu then. Do you think peace is ever possible in the Middle East? And do you think the two-state solution is the best way to go by in the present case? Because there's a lot of talk about how Israel's just pushing it to the extent where nobody in Israel actually believes in the two-state solution, and they're just pushing it as an idea, and it's just posturing.
You know, people ask me if I'm an optimist or a pessimist. I say I'm an optimist who worries a lot. But I am an optimist in that regard as far as the Middle East is concerned, because if you're not, then there is no way to even get your head around working the problem. I think that President Clinton actually came pretty close when we were at Camp David, And by the way, I think if I were to say to any of you, would you like to visit Camp David, you'd probably say yes. I can tell you after 2 weeks in the rain with the Israelis and Palestinians, I don't care if I ever go back. It was very painful kind of discussions, and partially, I think we made a mistake, which was not understanding fully the kinds of things that Arafat could or couldn't do. So any leader of the Palestinian people has a right to make decisions about the size of a Palestinian state. But because the Palestinians are not the only ones that have control over the holy places, the Saudis have responsibility for that, it would have been difficult for Arafat to make the decisions about the disposition of the holy places, and we're not in contact early enough with other Arabs in order to get that support. So the question is what decisions either party has to make, and do they have the competence to do it? I do believe in a two-state solution. That is something that we were arguing for early on. It certainly has been the basis of the policy, American policy, for a long time. But the U.S. can't make the decisions. It has to be done by the parties. And if I were an Israeli, and we've been saying this to the Israelis, is the U.S. is interested in the security of Israel, and we have an indissoluble relationship with them, that they would be much better off beside a friendly Palestinian state than the kind of thing that is going on now. What I believe is going on now is Secretary Kerry has taken this issue on right away. And he is spending a lot of time now in trying to develop an economic dimension to any kind of peace process out there, which is partially to try to give the Palestinians on the West Bank an economic reason to understand that they would be better off if they recognized a Jewish state, and giving them some real incentives. So he's put forward the idea of a big investment package in the West Bank to see whether that works or not. I think he is also working on the Israelis to limit their settlements and begin to see, for instance, some kind of a joint force in the valley there. So the answer is I am optimistic because the problem is being worked. I don't see anything other than a two-state solution. I mean, there are all kinds of other ideas out there, in terms of a one state, which is kind of hard. I think the Israelis would have a hard time accepting that because the Palestinian population is larger and larger, and they see themselves as a democracy. And so, for me, I have to say, I don't know why the Israelis are not cognizant enough of the values of a two-state solution. There is quite a large peace lobby in Israel, but they also have a political system which is kind of dragging things down in terms of a decision-making process. But basically, clearly it's a fascinating and important issue, and I think the important part for people that are interested in this to watch the evolution, because there's some new ideas coming into it. The other part that Secretary Kerry did was to get a reiteration of the Arab initiative, which basically goes back to the 67 borders, but also does say that there would be a recognition of Israel as a result of it. So he's put more things into the pot, and I think that he's trying to work the process. Yeah.
I have two questions. The first one is from your time from the Secretary of State. Now, that was the time after the Cold War. People generally across the world believe that market democracy is the ultimate form of government. Now, in the past 15 years, a lot has happened. You as a Secretary, and after that, the travel across the world. Did you see the change in perception from the time you were the Secretary of State to now about how people across the world perceive America? The second question is about one of the major reasons for that is the rise of China. Now, people generally nowadays believe that we've reached a post-American world. There would be a time when China would ultimately become a superpower, maybe at par with America. How do you take the rise of China? And do you think the so-called Chinese model of government and the Chinese, they call it the Beijing consensus, do you think that it has a part to play in the world? And if yes, what?
As somebody that spent a lot of time studying the international system and thinking about what the disposition of power is, I grew up in a very different kind. I grew up in a Cold War world, and definitely the constant kind of U.S.-Soviet competition, where, to go back to my foreign policy framework, we worked to get countries to be on our side. The Soviets worked on getting countries on their side, and all of a sudden there was the non-aligned movement. What I found interesting at the end of the Cold War, and I was at the United Nations, that the non-aligned movement continued to exist, and I kept saying, what are you non-aligned between? And so that basically didn't make a lot of sense. But we really did all grow up, at least I did, in a situation where there were certain institutions that were set up after World War II, and then the Cold War divided and froze that system, because all of a sudden the system was defrosted, and it was evident that the U.S. was the sole superpower. I have to tell you, it is fascinating to be the United States, because you're damned if you do or damned if you don't. I sat in the United Nations behind a sign that said the United States, and people expected me to do something about everything. And at the same time, when we did something, they said, you're interfering in our domestic affairs. So it was not a simple issue. But, and part, I think, is very important for people to understand. The United States does not want to be the world's policeman. One of the hard parts always is even persuading the American people that we have a business doing something somewhere in some country that they don't know where it is. And so, and we have our own problems, and so I think people have a misconception of what the United States wants to do. So I, however, as somebody who could see, the theme of my life, I have to tell you, is I mentioned earlier, the Czechoslovakia during World War II had basically been invaded by the Nazis as a result of the fact of Munich, an agreement made by the British and French with the Germans and Italians over the head of Czechoslovakia, and the United States wasn't there. And then when the United States entered the war, everything changed. And then when the United States, as a result of agreements, did not liberate Czechoslovakia, the Soviets took it over and everything changed. So my life has really been about the importance of American involvement. So there I am sitting behind the sign, and with a reluctant American population. So President Clinton said it first, but I kept saying it, so it became identified with me, that we were the indispensable nation. But that did not mean doing something alone. It was a way of motivating the American people to realize that we had to be engaged if anything was going to happen, and for the world to be stable, it was important for the United States to be involved. Now, what did happen was that people were looking at us, for us all the time, and there was this kind of sense that the U.S. should be involved, but also criticism of the fact that we thought we should run everything. So it was not a simple issue. I think that one of the things I've been talking about generally is that we're in a period where there is no faith in the international institutions. People don't think the UN can solve the problems. The European Union is a mess. There's a real question as to what the system is in this part of the world. The U.S. has begun to rebalance, but it's all very fluid at this time. And so we've got the G8 meeting at this moment. There are questions as to whether the G20 is a functional, real program of any kind. And so the question is, what is the power system at the moment? And I think it's unclear, frankly. I know that there's a lot of discussion about the Chinese and whether there's a G2 or something like that. The United States doesn't see it that way. I think that what we would like to see is a partnership with a number of different countries. And this is where India does come in, and not playing one country off against each other, but trying to figure out how the globalized system works. We do not think that the Chinese system is the best system. We do believe that market democracies are the best way to ensure stability and some kind of decent life for people. But I have no answers in terms of what the system is now, because, and this is why it's such an interesting time for all of you, is to try to figure out what the systems are and whether you choose different partners for different things. But what the U.S. wants that it doesn't have are partners who are willing to be part of taking responsibility. It's one thing to say, you know, we want to be a power, but unless you're willing to take responsibility for global governance and what happens, you know, why should India care about what's happening in Mali? Or why are we worried that the Chinese are trying to figure out what to do in the South China Sea, when you all should be worrying about it also, because it has to do with maritime or with sea lanes. And so the question is how you get other countries not just to declare themselves as partners, but to actually take that responsibility. So, but that is one of the big issues out there that I think that you all need to look at from your perspective as the generation that's going to take over.
Recently, in the case of, say, since we talk about sanctions, recently, the case of, say, we saw in Iraq or now in Iran and North Korea, how sanctions have quite been, sanctions, the idea would be to prevent the future generations from war, but finally we end up, these governments don't budge, and finally it's the population that feels the budge because of hyperinflation. And finally, instead of probably saving them from war, we're putting them through distress through sanctions. Because these governments now have sanctions become like an ineffective way to push through the UN.
Do sanctions work is the question.
Okay, back to my toolbox. I think that part of the problem is there is a problem out there, whatever it is, and the ex-government, the American government, tries to figure out what to do. And what happened in the 90s, as much as anything, was that the tool of choice became sanctions, because diplomacy seemed to be too slow, and we didn't want to use force everywhere. And so, and it is a tool which in some ways limits the behavior of the country that is being sanctioned. It tries to adjust the behavior, get a behavioral change, not necessarily regime change, but behavioral change. So the concern on the countries that you mentioned had Iran and North Korea has to do with nuclear issues. And the question is what sanctions to use. So we have learned a lot about sanctions, and partially, let me just make this clear generally. If there are complete sanctions on a country, as they were on Iraq or Cuba, for instance, there always is a humanitarian exceptions for food and medicine because people know that it affects the population. But generalized sanctions are a problem in terms of how it affects. So we got smarter on sanctions by beginning to talk about smart sanctions, which are targeted primarily against businesses that are somehow supporting nuclear technology or whatever it is you're sanctioning, and also individuals so that they can't travel or participate in financial activities, and there's sanctions on banks for services. So there is a way of trying to particularize it so it's not such a blunt instrument. The problem that one has generally with any one of the tools is to what extent the country that is the victim of all of this is responding to any of it at all. I think actually the argument could be made that the Iranian sanctions have worked because they have just elected a president. Instead of having the hardline president that was not responding at all, one could make the argument that there has been a positive response in that the Iranian people want to be more part of the world. The problem in North Korea is that, well, at the moment we don't know the guy running the country is your age. Or we don't even know what age he is, and I don't know what age you are. But I think that the bottom line is whether he cares at all about his people, and whether there will be a mechanism where that could be explained. But just to go back again, you don't like the behavior of a particular country, so which of these tools are you going to use? Ultimately, there's some interaction, you use all of them in some form or another, and they are kind of synchronized. Diplomacy is always there. I mean, watch Iran now. It'll be interesting to see whether there will be some change in the tool used. It strikes me there will be much more in terms of diplomacy. But one of the things that happens is the president of a country will always say all options are on the table. Because if you take a tool off the table, but it's that combination of the threat of the use of force, the potential of diplomacy, but sanctions have become kind of the tool of choice because it's in the middle.
As they say that with great powers come a lot of responsibilities. So US, as the current superpower, I just want to know that what is the vision for the next few decades, and what is the responsibility that US is willing to take up for its actions and for the proposals that it has, and what role does India play in that strategic planning ahead? And the sub question is that today we all as global citizens are really well connected. We are interacting over real time. So a lot of multiple diplomatic avenues like track 2 diplomacy, track 3 diplomacy are coming up. So I just wanted to know how seriously and how effectively does the nation state see those multiple alternative avenues of diplomacy for a new global order?
First of all, the United States is a status quo power. I think that is something to keep in mind. We are not an imperialist power. We are, and we also do, as I said earlier, don't want to be the policeman of the world. From the perspective of the United States, or from the perspective of India, every country's decision makers take their national interest into consideration. That's what it's about. Our national interest as a status quo power is to have a stable world where people live in peace and where there is a sense of improvement in people's lives, partially because we don't want to see the gap between the rich and the poor, partially because it's dangerous to have the gap between the rich and the poor. I think one of the issues that we have to try to deal with is how to fight terrorism without creating more terrorists, how to deal with the nuclear proliferation issues, how to deal with the energy, environment, global pandemic problems, how to narrow that gap between the rich and the poor, and deal with the financial globalization connection. So that's our agenda. Our agenda is to work with other countries on that. There's no way to do solve those problems. And I think India is viewed as a partner in that, in a very big way. And I think that the issue is how to develop partnerships that are really respectful of each other. And so that is the plan. The question is how you get from here to there. And so the interactions of that, I think, make the difference. Now, you raise a very important point. There are many more players in the system. And frankly, I have always advocated that there be a larger role for non-state actors not being terrorists, but being corporations. And pick one. Coca-Cola has more influence than Paraguay. I hope nobody here has any connections with Paraguay, but just any small country. And the question is how you bring them to the table. And I think one of the really interesting new mechanisms are public-private partnerships. And I have a global consulting firm, and one of the things that we do is work with companies like that, trying to figure out how they can play a role within an international system that is positive and kind of promotes good values, et cetera. So I think it's something to explore. it is not just a Westphalian state system, and how the non-state actors fit into it and where they sit at the table. I am not leaving here unless I answer a question from a woman.
I just wanted to know this from somebody who's been in the system. You've been like really prominent in international politics. I wanted to know how it is for a woman to be in that system, and did like your gender have any effect, especially with the attention which was given to your pins, your clothes, or how you were pretty much perceived by anybody who did not have the same ideas of equality which perhaps the United States of America has. The second question which I had for you was with regard to, say, there were statements which were made in like 1996 about the Iraq war and how the war, how the deaths were justified, or like it was the economics were like necessary. I wanted to ask you, do you think that did it have any effect, the continued invasion, the continued use of military force, did it have any effect on terrorism as such? Because Saddam's gone, but this thing still continued after that. So do you think it increased, or it sort of like curbed the issue, or did it have any effect whatsoever?
So on the first question, let me just say that when my name came up to be Secretary of State, people said a woman could not be Secretary of State because Arab governments or whatever wouldn't deal with a woman. So what happened was that, excuse me, the Arab ambassadors at the UN said, well, we had no problems dealing with Ambassador Albright. We wouldn't have any problems dealing with Secretary Albright. I actually had more problems with the men in our own government. And not because they were all male chauvinist pigs, but because they had seen me through this very long story of having been a carpool mother, and I was a friend of their wife's. I had been a staffer. I made an awful lot of coffee in my life. And so they wondered, how did she get to be Secretary of State when I should be Secretary of State? The reason that it all worked was that President Clinton made very clear that he wanted me as Secretary of State, and in fact would always make it a point of making clear that he wanted to hear what I had to say and that I had the senior job within our cabinet. First time I went over as Secretary of State to meet with the Gulf Cooperation Council ministers, I did arrive in a very large plane that said United States of America, but we were sitting there, and at the end of it I said, thank you so much, this has been a great meeting. And maybe you've noticed that I'm not dressed the same way as my predecessors, and next time let's talk about women's rights. And we did, and many of them brought their wives and daughters, and so it was a slow process, but nevertheless it was something that I think was very evident that if they wanted to deal with the United States, they would have to deal with me. What happened at the UN, for instance, when I got there, there were 183 countries. I get to my residence, I thought there'd be a lot of people there. There were 6 other women representing Canada, Philippines, Kazakhstan, Trinidad, Tobago, Jamaica, and Liechtenstein, and me. So being the American, I organized a caucus, and we called ourselves the G7, and we lobbied on behalf of women judges on the War Crimes Tribunal, etc. When I was Secretary of State, there were only 14 women foreign ministers. Now I think there are many more, and I think that there is a recognition of the growth of women in national security jobs, but not as much as there should be. My granddaughter, when she turned 7 3 years ago, said, so what's the big deal about Grandma Maddie being Secretary of State? Only girls are Secretary of State. And now people make jokes as to whether a man can be Secretary of State. We are about to have a woman National Security Advisor, Susan Rice, and there are more women in the system, but frankly, not enough. On the other issue, let me just say, and this is a warning to all of you, the sanctions issue was a very big deal. And as I said earlier, I was an instructed ambassador, and it was important to have the sanctions stay on. I also deliberately said what I said about that there is never, even complete sanctions, never touch food and medicine. But Saddam Hussein is the one that is responsible for the problem of the starving people of Iraq, because he never allowed the distribution of food and medicine, nor would he pay for any of it. And ultimately, we started trying to do a deal which was oil for food, but he would not allow distribution of it. But, and this is the warning, is that I was on a television show, kept being asked about it. I believed, and to this day I believe, that Leslie Stahl was led around by the information minister in Iraq to show the problem. I wish you'd stand up. I mean, the bottom line is I made a really stupid statement. I have a but just remember what the basis of it was, is that it was not the United States that was causing it, and one should be really careful about what you say, even if you think that you're being pressed on something, and reframe the question. So it is a warning to all of you to be careful in this kind. And I regret it. This happens to me. I'm always get the same question every time. And there is a cottage industry out there that makes sure that the question stays up. And believe me, I know it. Do not Google me. This comes up every single time, or if you wish to have it come up every single time. But the bottom line is I said a stupid thing, and people should be careful about saying things like that. So,
how long does it take, or how difficult or easy is it to execute something in a developed country like US compared to a developing country in India?
That is a really good question. In both places, it takes a very long time. I think that one of the issues that is interesting is we operate within a governmental system, and one expects that the government will carry out a lot of decisions. When you're in the government, you say, oh, well, no business would function like this. Why does it take so long? Now that I am in the business world, I can tell you it takes an awful long time in the business world. And part of the problem for the difficulty of execution of decisions is the siloing of the various parts that need to take some aspect of the decision. There's no decision that is just taken by one piece of the government. And so I've been going to an awful lot of meetings here for my business with Pramath, and so any one of them says to us, well, it isn't just my responsibility. Now, some of it is, pointing fingers at somebody else, but the bottom line is that a lot of the decisions actually go across a number of ministries. If you have a democratic system with a parliament or Congress, they also play a role in it. And so the execution, the question is, do you have somebody at the top that actually makes sure that things get executed? In our system of government, the president is the one that pulls this together, and the National Security Council in foreign policy issues is the one that makes sure that the issues are executed, but they still have to go down through a series of different departments. And just to connect the dots here for all of you, one of the reasons why it's important to understand other disciplines is to understand how the execution goes through different parts of it, and then try to figure out how to connect it. But I think probably, I have difficulty saying this, I'm not sure that the developed system, ours being the major one at this point, is any better at making the decisions than in a developing system. Because there are arguments that go on, some of the bureaucratic politics that take place, and again, the latitude, the horizontal aspect of making the decisions, and it ultimately takes the will of the individuals to make it happen. And so, and maybe this is a good way to conclude, is I have this, I teach my students about this, that there are really 5 factors that every government has to deal with in making foreign policy decisions, which is what I teach about. First of all, objective. Where is the country? What are the facts about the country? It isn't just geographical location, but the resources, the demographic profile. than subjective, how does a country feel about itself at any given time? We've talked about this a little bit. You know, is the U.S. in charge or other countries part of it? The third is how the government is organized, executive, legislative, parliamentarians, how many parties, all that. The fourth is about the bureaucratic politics, which are most reflected in what the budget looks like, because the arguments are over money within the system. And the fifth is the role of individuals. And so that combination is what determines what decision is made in the first place, but then in the way that it is carried out. And to return to why I reread War and Peace, and why I quote part of it in my class is, there is a piece in it in which it Tolstoy describes that the Tsar Nicholas and Tsar Alexander actually thought that he had made the decisions, and Napoleon thought that he had made the decisions, and there was there's one great phrase in it, is the higher that you are, the less likely you're the one that's making the decisions. And so I don't happen to believe that. I'm not a determinist. I do believe in the role of the individual, but it's interesting to think, and it goes a little bit to answer your question about how does something get executed? Not by some powers up here, but ultimately making sure that that combination of various elements within a government actually work together. And it's why you have a president or a prime minister who is elected and can be removed if does not, in fact, execute on those decisions.